Hey, everybody. Hello to our friends in Brussels, Washington, Singapore. We just hired somebody in Kenya. So we're increasingly paying attention to privacy and data protection around the world. I'm delighted to talk to some of our friends in Europe this morning. I'm Jules Polonetsky, CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum, where we are optimistic about what can be done with new technologies and data if we have laws, policies, structures, restrictions, protections that shape these so that they actually achieve what we'd like to see for society and not indeed go down a Orwellian path where risks and dangers of different sorts can evolve. So I don't know, maybe it's silly today to be an optimistic in a time of what we see happening in data, but I'll plead guilty with the notion that it's also some of the solutions that we see that have been critical to developing new methods, hopefully in some ways to improve our lives, or at least stay connected during this time of COVID. I'm delighted that today I have with me some fabulous people. Rob van Eijk, our managing director for Europe. Rob is in the Rotterdam general area today. And
no, I'm in Brussels. Actually,
you're
in
in Brussels today.
Yeah.
Oh, fabulous. Rob is in our Brussels office today. So delighted to have him join from there. I'm here in the Washington, D.C. office, and we have two fabulous guests whose work we are intrigued with, who we have admired, but who have a really interesting project that is of particular interest. We have worked on smart city issues for a number of years. Our team will post in the comments the interactive tool that we created for city leaders to sort of map out what are the different technologies that are being used, because we all have maybe some idea in mind, but the amazing number of ways that data and technology is being used in the urban landscape goes far beyond, frankly, what I have appreciated. And every week I learn of something new. Sensors on trash cans, sensors on light posts, people counting, car counting, you name it, we'll probably learn of some new today. So we created a tool where you could sort of navigate the cityscape, see the different technologies, see some of the obvious privacy risks, but also start talking about some of the solutions. So we hope it's useful. But without any further ado, Rob, let me turn to you for a moment, and then we'll jump into this discussion about data walks, a really novel way to bring average citizens and I guess even experts into this conversation. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much happening, and that means there's also a lot of scrutiny by DPAs as well. And I have here, for example, the Smart Cities guidance by the Dutch Data Protection Authority, which was released in July 2021. There are many, many regulatory questions about privacy risks and lawfulness, etc. So today we're mostly going to focus on like transparency and the awareness of people and how are people experiencing this technology. But there's also a whole world around for the privacy pros out there. And I think that discussion is only just happening. So with that, I'm very curious what we can learn today.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll also get a little bit, maybe a taste of some of the interesting legal and policy challenges. But Jonas Breuer at Brussels Free University, VUB, as many of us know it, and Ina van Zeeland, also at VUB. They've got other affiliations that they'll tell us about as well, where they do some of their work. Delighted. Data walks. Is it as simple as walking through a city and pointing to the different sensors and saying, what's that? Let us know. Tell us. Jonas, I turn to you.
Yes, in fact, it's actually quite a simple way of getting very interesting results for us as researchers. I will just start sharing my screen. It will take only a second. I think there we go. Perfect. So, yes, thanks so much for having us. It's really great that we can share our knowledge with this community here. And so Ian and I, we are both researchers, PhD researchers actually in Brussels, at the Free University of Brussels. We work for the research center that is called SMIT, SMIT, and we're actually not legal experts per se. We are communication scientists. So working in the field of how cities are being changed by data processing technologies, but also always with a special focus on the user, on user studies. How are people involved when it comes to innovation of new technologies? We as a communication scientist are really interested in this interaction with different stakeholders and between different stakeholders. So based on all of this, we started looking into the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and especially certain rights that data subjects or users of data processing technologies have. And we came up with a methodology that we would really like to talk about today. So Walk the Talk, workshops for privacy-friendly smart cities. We will give a little bit of an overview of what this methodology is, where we come from with the idea, and but then mainly want to highlight some of the conclusions, some of the insights that we have after a good 3 handfuls of walks so far in different cities, only in Belgium. And then we would love to discuss, the merits and the downsides of the methodology, but obviously as well the insights of the from the citizens. So, urban revolution, smart cities. This is all what we're talking about these days a lot in our work context. So, what is the smart city? Very quickly, urban spaces that aim to integrate the physical and digital worlds through new technologies. And that is a lot about capturing and processing personal data. So on the right, you see what you might know already, at least. It's a rather common sight in European cities. It's a smart dustbin. So a dustbin that has some kind of sensor in it and is connected to the Internet of Things and does apparently supposedly wonderful things that makes our lives much better. So smart cities are data cities. Data is captured by city officials, but also by private corporations, and so far more and more also by citizens, obviously through the mega computer that we have in our pockets these days. I'm really happy that Jules also mentioned in his presentation that we are certainly not only pessimistic about new technologies, and I think that's really important because this was part of our mission when we did these walks as well. We really want to make clear that there's certain benefits. There certainly is certain benefits, and maybe also some and certainly some ways that make the lives of the quality of lives of citizens better. But we want to see it really critically, and we want to decide together with as many different people as possible what is the right way, what is the good way, and what we want the smart city to be about. So thanks a lot, Jules, for that introduction. So benefits, for example, safety, real-time decision-making, coming back to the garbage cans that supposedly allow the companies to produce less CO2 because they can plan their routes better. This is just one small example of certain benefits. But then obviously there's clear risks to the rights and freedoms of anyone walking around. The rights to privacy, obviously. We could also think about, luckily not in our countries here yet, but we could also think to our freedoms of demonstration, freedoms of uttering our opinions in public, etc. So there's also, I would say, a clear risk of exacerbations of inequalities when we look at developments of smart cities so far. But luckily, or not luckily, but there is the data protection, the GDPR and the data protection rights, which kind of makes sense when we talk about a data city. So why wouldn't we also look at this regulation from 2018 and some of those fundamental rights that are anchored or that are communicated here. Relevant provisions for smart city citizens, we think what we are mostly interested in this regard is, for example, the lawful basis for processing. Clearly not only consent, it's very important for us that consent is probably the least good basis for processing in the smart city context. We are very interested in the right to be informed. How is information, what is the right kind of information? How is information communicated? What kind of information that actually creates a transparent environment of data processing, or also not? Of course, there's also other data subject rights, and one of my main cores to my work are also data protection impact assessments, or privacy impact assessments. And I'm just shortly mentioning this because this kind of links up then to the work that we anyway would be doing with users and technology. So how do we involve people? Because public participation is clearly a much talked about thing, and also a praised solution for many problems. Of course, let's involve people, let's talk to people, let's get the kind of the tacit knowledge of people that live in the street when we want to do an urban development project, etc. And it's true, it's clearly true that there's many good aspects of public participation and stakeholder involvement, but there's still also clear challenges that come with this, inherent challenges actually to public participation. The lack of the awareness or literacy of people to involve, lack of time, opportunity, or patience, so basically lack of interest in being involved. When we talk about smart city data processing and the GDPR, or fundamental rights to data protection, privacy, it's very complex, these topics. So how can we expect people, or how can we make people understand enough to become meaningfully involved in these discussions? So that's actually really challenging. And obviously, it's not easy to reach all layers of society and all groups of society. One might even say it's almost impossible. So we had the idea, not only because of Corona, obviously it was much more difficult to organize workshops or focus groups or interviews, insights during the Corona. So also a little bit because of out of the practicality, we thought, well, we think about the city, we think about data processing, kind of the link between the digital, which might be a bit vague for many people, but also the physical in the street, a camera, a sensor in the street. So why don't we actually go outside and go for a walk and discuss and have a discussion while we walk? So actually it's a very simple concept, a very simple methodology, and it's far from you. I would really also want to stress that some of my academic role models or examples have done this before. Alison Powles from the London School of Economics has inspired me very clearly with her data walks, and Adam Greenfield, an urban activist, already longer in the field, criticizing smart city and related technologies, has been doing workshops in different cities with his, I think, previous agency, which is really, we have not been the inventor of this methodology. But we have managed to change it, to adapt it to the more the data protection, data processing context. And so far, it has worked really well. We have done more than 14 workshops because we did some tests before, but 14 workshops with more than 100 citizens in 3 Belgian cities. We then also were able to organize, not in all 3, but in 2 of the 3 cities, a feedback workshop with, well, let's call them decision makers, DPOs, project managers, council members. And they were actually interested in joining us. So just to say that this has been quite successful. We've been doing the actual walks. We started planning in I think in May, June, July. And we have been doing the actual walks from September last year to, well, actually just this week, the last ones. On the right, you can just see this is the city of Leuven. It's a short route of like 1.3 kilometers, not too much, with different centers along the route. Some nice time in between to also talk about, and very importantly to have a bit of fun while you're doing this, to not be too formal, to not be too serious about this. So normally 1.5 hours, up to 10 participants. More is difficult to facilitate. one or two facilitators, and then one note taker, because we did not record or did not want to record anything in audio or in video. We can talk about that later if anyone is interested in this methodological considerations. So really fast about what we've been doing and why, and then I think maybe Ine can start with giving the interesting parts of this presentation.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what we found when we were talking and walking with citizens. Of course, when we were walking around, more or less like Jules described, we walked around, we pointed at technologies, and we asked them, do you know how this works? Do you have any idea what happens with the data? What would you like to know? Because some people just don't want to know what happens. And so what we found specifically on the topic of transparency is that even when the information provision was as described in the GDPR, citizens often do not feel that they have been sufficiently informed, that they really understand what's happening, and there's actually more questions that they might have. Sometimes there are even trust issues, so they simply do not believe the information that is provided. But we also have to be, clear here that most people just ignore the signs. So for instance, when it comes to cameras, some people would ask, like, are there like signs for them? And then we would say, yes, there are. There's one over there. And then they said, oh, I've never actually noticed them. So most people don't even notice the signs. And if they do, they don't really want to read them. And that actually, surprisingly, also included the, let's say, the administrators that we talked to who actually work for these smart city projects. For instance, we had one example in Brussels where our walk passed through a commercial shopping center, and the shopping center had some information about, you're being tracked here with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. But it was a little bit to the side of the entrance, and it wasn't really that easy to find that sign. And then even the administrators of smart city projects were really surprised that there was a sign here explaining this kind of tracking. So yeah, most people don't notice the information signs, and so you might ask if that is really the best way to inform people. Some people who did find the signs eventually, after we pointed them out, said, actually, I feel more anxiety now about what's happening here. So just providing information may also provoke anxiety. Then we asked people, of course, so how do you, what kind of information would you like to have? And they all said, well, if you are going to collect data about me here, I would like to know, of course, why. So most of these information signs based on the camera law in Belgium only give a general description of the controller and then some contact details. And actually people want to know why this information is being collected here. What are the benefits for society, or what are the benefits for me? And is there any good news? Like, how are you improving my life by collecting and processing this data? Jonas, if you could go to the next slide, yeah. And then, of course, we also talked with them about the risks and the concerns that they have. And this is a bit of an artificial distinction that we made. So we distinguished, let's say, risks when we are talking about calculable risks that you can prevent with technical measures. And we distinguish them from concerns that people may have that may have less of a factual basis, or that are facts but are less difficult or less easy to predict and prevent. But we have to stress here that those concerns in themselves can be risks. For instance, if people feel they cannot freely express themselves because they're being monitored all the time, the so-called chilling effect, then this is in itself a risk to democracy. This affects freedom of expression, this affects freedom to demonstrate. So just a concern in itself can be a risk. Now, the risks that they mentioned were things like incorrect decisions based on the data or misuse of the data, re-identification. So we would say, oh, well, these data are only used in the aggregate. And then they would say, yeah, but if you combine this data set with another data set, you might still be able to tell that I was here shopping at a certain hour, for instance. They would also discuss indeed the democratic challenges of algorithmic decision making. So the fact that you cannot ask a computer or a system how it came to a certain decision. And so they would also, of course, mention data breaches. Like, okay, if my data are in here, somebody might hack the system, and then that would be a risk. Their concerns would be different. They would say, I don't really like it if companies profit from public data. I just don't, I don't like it. There's not a specific reason why I don't, but I feel concerned about this. They would mention things like inequality that, or as Jonas already mentioned at the beginning, some inequalities might be exacerbated if you are going to base decisions on data. There may be issues of social injustice. People, again, were afraid that data would be shared with third parties without our knowledge. There would be profiling in public space. Some people thought that cameras look ugly, all those cameras all around, or IT creates too much energy problems. And they would worry, of course, about surveillance. This was very obvious. And so this was also one of the reasons why we didn't record the walks in any way, not in audio or in video, because we felt, okay, if we're talking about surveillance, because everybody brings this up, we don't want to also be filming people. Now, when it comes to the other things that people mentioned, this is why we believe that the workshops are really providing a new element that could also be useful for data protection impact assessments, because people would mention things that, behind a desk in an office you could not come up with. They would mention things like, well, there's this datafication of everyday life, that really bothers me. Or I feel like I have less autonomy if people are trying to manipulate me based on the data that they collect about citizens. They would also mention things like the vulnerability to infrastructural interruptions. So if the internet drops away, then some things might not work in the city anymore. So these are the kinds of things that we believe are not generally taken into account when somebody conducts a data protection impact assessment for a smart city project. We also discussed the proportionality and necessity of certain technological interventions with the participants. Many participants told anecdotes about camera surveillance that was happening in a certain area, and yet when they tripped over something, nobody came to help, or when their bike was stolen, the police could do nothing with the camera images. These things were actually happened very often, and mentioned very often. We talked about proportionality as well. So we talked about, for instance, different ways to measure how parking spaces were used, and then people would prefer less privacy intrusive technologies if they were available. But there were also people who just simply liked the security of having a camera everywhere, or the fact that they could prove that they really paid because there was a camera pointed on their payment system. And they also liked the fact that camera monitoring can deter people who might have wrong intentions. So there were actually, I wouldn't say it was 50-50, the majority of people who registered to participate in these workshops had more concerns than and that they were happy to see more privacy intrusive technologies, but there were also people who actually liked to be monitored all the time. And I think that brings us almost, to the end. So we evaluate our evaluation. Maybe Jonas, you want to go into that?
Yeah, so obviously, as academic researchers, we thought a lot about the methodology itself. We did some testing rounds, and we are clearly aware that there is advantages, but also shortcomings. So we have noticed that it does improve literacy. So we managed to inform the people on a really easygoing, interesting level. It helps to get kind of on a level that we can start discussing certain more complex topics. We did feel that in some ways this idea of walking and meeting outside and having a really low threshold, low barrier methodology, that it does make it more attractive, and is also in some way maybe more inclusive than, for example, a long survey where someone who cannot read already is not included, as an example, is already not included in the potential sample. I think one of the things that I like most about this is that it provides really nuanced info, nuanced insights, and a nuanced feedback from the participants on well, I would call it very broadly risk perceptions. And so this means that on the one hand, this is certainly qualitative research, and we are obviously aware that a sample of 10 people let's say 100 people is nothing compared to the populations of the 3 cities where we have done those walks. But it's not really the aim to be statistically representative. It is really to add, or to think about, can we add this qualitative perceptions and the more subjective feelings to otherwise, kind of, I would say quantified topic, quantified domain, because we talk about data and we talk about data-driven decision making. So per se, it kind of feels that this efficiency of the smart city is more important in the discourse, not more important to us, but in the discourse than how do you feel as a citizen about what's happening in your city. And I think this is really important for us, and I think that's why for us as qualitative researchers this has been quite successful. Still, obviously, exclude citizens. We've clearly had a majority of mid to older people, so let's say 40 above, with a concentration of, let's say, 50 to 65-year-olds. This also has to do with our sampling and registration strategies. We have reports. You're very welcome to read about that. So still, obviously, not ensured that the voices or the opinions are heard, because it depends then how are the decision makers taking over the information that we give them. And clearly practical limitations, several of them where only the weather, the difficult note-taking, and other interruptions like noise are just a few examples here.
So I wonder if I can jump in with some questions, because I have so many. If you were observing, the light went off in the office because the smart sensor on the wall here determined that I'm not moving enough. Maybe if I wave a little, oh, there you go. Now that the sensor has detected my presence, but clearly, there's a problem. It's not calibrated appropriately. And we've heard city leaders talk about the city as a platform, almost the way Android and iOS, the smartphone operating systems, are platforms, and third parties, whether it's Uber or whether it's transportation companies or other city agencies that have particular missions, are almost like the apps that are building on top of this infrastructure. And when you think about it like that, you can say, all of a sudden say, oh, wait a second, this is really a challenge when it comes to data, because we know those are very challenging data flows with rules and restrictions, and we don't seem to talk as much about the API that the city is seeing. I have on the shelf on the other side of the room a sticker that the transportation leader of the city of Los Angeles, which has really challenging transportation problems. Right, it doesn't have an underground or a metro. It's huge traffic. It's spread out, and the lower income people cannot get to a job, even though it's not so far. But there's no transportation that really works. So they really see, hey, we can't spend $10 billion. We can't do it. But can we use data and third parties and technology to somehow attack the inequities that lower income people can't get to the good healthcare or can't get to the jobs that are available? So what kinds of technologies, you mentioned, of course, cameras, and I think everybody knows, yes, there's surveillance cameras. Maybe they're surprised at how many once you point it out. But what are the other technologies did you see? You mentioned the smart trash cans, but what other sorts of sensors? We know that during COVID, a lot of cities took advantage of the relative, emptiness of the streets to put new bike paths, to think about reordering transportation, and they're measuring this now that we have a little bit of a return. Is it working? How many cars? What sorts of technologies did you see? And did the people have a different reaction? I mean, a camera, it's not the first time probably they were aware there's a surveillance camera, but probably some of the other things you pointed out were very novel to them. Welcome your thoughts on these questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that come to mind when you say that. Maybe I can just start with something that indeed has been very present also in the public debate and in the media, which is crowd measurements or crowd measuring. Because of COVID, several, I might even say many cities here have thought of the idea, yeah, we have to measure our shopping streets, we have to measure our cities, how many people are actually there, and is it still okay, or if there's too many, then we might have to involve the police or some kind of authority to solve this crowded situation. What was really interesting was to, again, to talk about proportionality when it comes to this, because there has been different projects and different testing of different technologies going on from cameras, which are supposedly anonymized, so that are on functioning on edge computing, so no actual personal data is sent to a server. But then there were also other tryouts, for example, sonar, I think it was sonar-based technology that simply tracks or measures if anything comes through. So the discussion was quite lively because people really had the experiences, or had at least heard about it lately. And I think the cameras are the most known, and many of the other alternatives seemed to be much less known. And the question was then often that came up, so why do our cities pay so much money to have a camera? And would there not be another way of doing this in a very similarly efficient way? And even couldn't we also send, there was a smaller context now of a project in a park, couldn't we put a job student or an intern there to measure how many people are there actually, instead of having a fancy and actually quite expensive camera system that measures if someone is playing football or basketball in that park. So I think that the cameras are certainly the most known in Flanders, unfortunately, but also because the decisions seem to tend to lead to the installation of cameras when I look around here.
Ina, you made some comments about how people didn't see the notice, or didn't interact with the notice, and some of the challenges. There was a project, I think it still exists, that some of the people who were involved with the Sidewalk Labs effort in Toronto, they then spun off like a notices project, trying to create sort of standard symbols in the hope that, like, a camera, we know what a camera probably should look like, but these other sensors, sonar, or not face cameras, but detecting ear sound for gunshots. We have those deployed in a lot of cities, or other kinds of sensors that are reading a license plate or so forth. Do you have any optimism that simply making the notices better, everybody now wants to have better labels, better notices, nutrition labels, and somehow if we just got the label better and designed it with the right warning or the right information, then people would like, I get it. What's your, is there a path here to better notices, or is that futile based on, how you saw people interacting?
Yeah, that is a very good question, actually. I would say yes. I mean, the notices can definitely be better and bigger and more in your face, because very often they're hidden. But in some cases, for instance, in many of these cities that we did our walks, the cities themselves would, for instance, buy data from mobile network companies. And so what would you do? Like hang signs all around the inner city saying, careful now, your data are being sold to the city by an external provider. I mean, these kinds of things, in some cases, when the data collection is really pervasive, it will be difficult to have these kinds of explanations. And I noticed that somebody in the comments also said, like, can we use an app, for instance, to explain these kinds of things to people? But one of the issues that we wanted to address actually with our workshops was that not everyone uses a smartphone. And anyone can go on a walk and actually see in the space where they are, what's happening there, but it doesn't mean that they understand it. And so, yes, I do think that perhaps working with icons that are like that are standardized in some way or that would improve the situation, but would still not cover every possible kind of application that we've seen. And I think Rob also had some examples that he would like to mention, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe to mention, in terms of explaining what's happening to people, it's worth mentioning that the city of Amsterdam actually went to great lengths to produce an online map where people can actually see where the different types of sensors are located. For instance, there are 3D sensors, counting cameras, Wi-Fi sensors, but also during COVID, they were using a camera system that takes so-called stereoscopic images and then actually has an algorithm to convert these images into coordinates. So the 3D sensors, they determine position and movement. And the good thing to understand this here in terms of explaining how things work, people need to visualize this in terms of which street corners is this actually taking place. But also, if you then click on a sensor, you can find out what's the privacy policy attached. Who can I ask questions to? What data categories are actually being collected, etc. And what I really struck me was specifically these privacy by design explanations, that a lot of this obviously needs to take place on the sensors itself, is part of that information provision as well. So I'll have some more examples, but I'll leave that to a little bit later in the discussion.
You know, when COVID hit, it was interesting to see the different discourse around information about COVID apps and around COVID data and who's infected and so forth in Europe versus in the US. Europe, in some ways, had a much more rational conversation because there was some understanding that just because perhaps you collect some data doesn't mean it's going to be sold or used by other agencies or becoming part of some health insurance, profile that will cost you money or turn down your insurance because there's a legal structure. And in the US, as soon as there was a lot of confusion. Well, is this even going to be covered by our medical privacy law? And in many cases, if it wasn't, your doctor and health insurance, but the other mechanisms, your employer and so forth, it wasn't covered. And there was no way to promise people, don't worry, this can't be used or sold or traded because we didn't have the legal structure. So in some ways, and frankly, even now, as we're working on many areas of new legislation in the US, states are passing legislation, as many may know. We exclude public data because we say, well, wait a second, that's public. So it's not private, it's in the street. Or we have some constitutional challenges of saying, hey, you saw something, you can't go use that information. So many of the laws are carving it out or struggling. And of course, again, in Europe, just because it's public doesn't mean now it can be, sold and monetized. Is it your sense, all of you, that there is a roadmap for this? There are, privacy by design and data minimization and purpose limitation, and even the notion that you can't just put up a sensor and say, hey, this is interesting, I'd like to test this out. You need a legal, basis. Your agency may not actually have the right to do it without a law or fitting in some other, mandate. So how sophisticated is the discussion? I know in some cities there's really been a lot of care, but as you've been doing your research, have you been surprised that it's done in such a maybe loose way? Or have you dug in and started to see, oh, wait a second, this was authorized and there was a privacy impact assessment done and there's rules around minimizing and the data has to be deleted and no other agency can get it? Have you started seeing and being maybe nicely surprised or shocked that all of these legal and technical elements that are the law in many of the countries, are these in place?
I can maybe answer a little bit, but I think also Jonas knows a little bit more about how this works in smart city projects. I think it starts already from a difference in definition. So in Europe, indeed, like personal data can include data that has already been published. And so it still may be, indeed, as long as the definition is as long as you can lead it back to a single individual, this is personal data. And so whether it's been published by this person before, if it's used for another purpose already, we have to have some kind of, at least a policy or technical and organizational measures about it, and transparency, of course. But that is on paper. And then I have to say that, of course, the introduction of the GDPR meant that it raised awareness for all kinds of organizations that they have to be more careful with these things. And so I don't know what the situation in the US is to that extent, but I do believe that indeed there is some awareness, at least among organizations around the European Union, that as soon as they start working with personal data, that they need to take certain precautions, let's say. But Jonas, perhaps you can talk a bit more about what you've learned, because you've interviewed a lot of DPOs at municipalities, what you've learned on that topic.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting topic, especially in Belgium, because we are a little country with how can I say, with many a little bit complex country. So when we think about the data protection in the smart city, only that we have to consider so many different laws and regulations already, that for me as a non-legal expert, it has become quite complicated to get an overview. So there's the GDPR, but then there's also a camera law from 2007 and then updated in 2018. There's the police law, and then wonderfully, some of those things are also not the same on the regional level. So we have been operating now in Flanders, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, then on this regional level and the federal level of the Belgian state. So I must actually say that I find it so confusing that I don't have a really good overview of what's happening here in Belgium.
I'll note that Professor Theodore Christakis at the University of Grenoble is doing a study of where are all the different legal obligations that already exist over cameras and facial recognition, because indeed there is, yes, GDPR, and now efforts to add more, perhaps, if there's AI or machine learning involved, which is very often the case. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he publishes on that. Rob, you've looked a little more closely, though, as well, on some of the legal, basis on some of these things. We've may I remind people that one of Rob's very famous cases that he worked on when he was at the Dutch DPA was around the Google Street View, and which involved, of course, scanning the Wi-Fi networks and using it to add to the geolocation services and so forth. I'm one of the few people that has opted out by editing the name of my home router. Instead of it being Jules's house, it's Jules's house _ opt out. And of course, if you want to opt out of the Microsoft version of this, you have to use a different terminology. So your home router needs to be Jules Polonetsky _ opt out _ I think do not track. And then if you want to opt out of Skyhook and some of the other companies that build this service, you need to go to their webpage and put in the information about your router, at which point Uber will never be able to find your home, and maybe that it will be something you're happy about. But Rob, what's the lead? Have we seen good data privacy impact assessments that have been done by some jurisdictions? Have we seen some models where any city has really done a very good job and has a very strong program that we should model? I know Barcelona was really doing a lot of work where they were really trying to build GDPR protections into their smart city work.
Yeah, it's a little bit out of our orbit, but there's another network of cities, and they cooperate in the Polis network. And this includes cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, Toronto, but also like Barcelona and Amsterdam, for example. So I have not seen any privacy impact assessment there in the DPIAs, but I reckon that these privacy officers are really doing their homework. That's
those should
obviously
be
important.
public and accessible, right? Like you could
Yeah.
FOIA that. I
It's
wonder.
not a legal requirement, but they fall under the Freedom of Information laws. So for researchers, I think that's another data source that you really should look into. And also do data subject access requests. That's another tool that's available, not just for researchers, but for any data subject, obviously. Yeah, so, I mean, this is all about what's a proper legal base. And public interest is most of the times the legal base that the city has to go back to, because consent is just not practical. You cannot be informed before your MAC address is being picked up by a radio antenna when legally the processing is already starting. And I have maybe to remark that the legitimate interest legal ground is not available for public organizations when processing personal data in the public space. However, Google Street View case, we're talking about a private entity collecting and processing data in the public space, could rely on a legitimate interest legal ground. And that's in fact the conclusion of the investigation of the Dutch DPA at that time. Most of the time, an opt-out needs to be provided as well. And in this case, the proposition by Google was no map, but you talked about underscore opt-out and underscore do not track. Obviously, this is not very standardized. And it's very important when we collect data through sensor networks that there is some kind of consensus and common sense about, okay, how are we going to communicate these signals and what type of standardized opt-out mechanism do we build in. So in terms of this discussion on Wi-Fi tracking, it's obviously clear that the Dutch has a very strict interpretation of processing personal data. Even if it's already anonymized on the sensor, you still need a valid legal ground, which the city usually cannot provide. And that discussion has not finished yet. And this is why the Dutch DPA started to kick the can down the road a little bit with their guidance that was provided last year. But it's clear that most of the times it's just prohibited. Maybe interesting to note that there's a lot of innovation happening in this space as well. One example that I would like to point out is that infrared signals, it's similar to the sensor you have in your office, Jules, can also be fitted to traffic lights. And in Rotterdam, they now have a pilot which the infrared sensor, well, basically counts the number of cyclists that are queuing up in front of a traffic light. And an algorithm then decides, okay, we have now 3 cyclists standing here, maybe a little bit rain there. We need to make sure these people get moving, so the cars are stopped, etc. So this is like a really nice privacy by design type of sensor that does not involve any processing of personal data at all. Another one, and it really ties into cameras, because cameras are obviously a rich source, not just for number plate recognition, but also in terms of, can we maybe transpose the real image of a person that's walking into a wireframe? So you get rid of all the physical characteristics that may identify or single you out in a crowd, and just make everybody the same with the same little microframe that's like walking across the bridge. And that way, there's now a pilot going on to try to see to what extent can we study and optimize the passenger flows across the bridge. And I think that's a very interesting new type of design. So next to infrared sensors, it's like the anonymization on the sensor by transposing people into wireframes. And lastly, I wanted to add that Rotterdam has a very big harbor, and it's now being fitted or digitized with an Internet of Things sensor network. And it's providing information, for instance, on harbor services and free mooring spaces. But it's also collecting data and communicating data real time on, for instance, whether a bridge is open or closed. So this allows for remote monitoring to keep our feet dry, but also, for instance, to make sure our water is clean. And this whole type of digitization, it's not just happening in passenger flows, but also like on waterways and other infrastructures like roads and things we use. And in the near future, you will see digitization in the airspace as well to optimize drone flows as well, because that's obviously the next flow that's going to be very present in the public space.
Whenever I'm in an airport, I see the sign that says the wait time at this security queue, is 6 minutes and 2 seconds. And of course, I know it's because of the device that's counting how the phones are moving along the queue. But I always remark that people look at that and they don't ask, how do you know? Who's doing this? There's nobody standing there like in the old days giving you a card saying, oh, hand this back. I wrote a time on it and hand it back. But we kind of just somehow assume magically, without even thinking, is this technology, is this tracking? It's almost like normalizing that we expect kind of the technology to work. As we come close to the end, where do you go next? Do we see some publications? Do you have ideas for how you are building on this? What's the future of your research here?
So first of all, we are working at the moment. Yeah, of course, we are doing some publications, but one publication that we just submitted is actually a quantitative research survey based on a sample of, I think, around 2,500 Flemish people, where we also want to investigate, but then from a quantitative perspective, very similar aspects, concerns around privacy and data protection of citizens, to see how our qualitative insights correspond with this. So I think this is really important to understand for us, to even more understand the value of what we've been doing. Then another step is looking more concretely at data protection impact assessments, and can we think of a workshop as a potential way of involving data subjects when doing decisions prior or during a data processing operation. It does seem that people might be interested. I think the Dutch TPA and the report that you guys have provided last year, which is really, I think, the best one so far from that perspective. I hope that this kind of makes it interesting, our approach to this. And I think Rob has also suggested that we might get some data protection officers or authorities on a walk to also discuss with them what we've been hearing from the citizens. So I do think it seems that there's a lot of interest. Different organizations here in Flanders come to us. We don't have the time actually at the moment to do this, but we would really like to formalize the methodology and offer it as obviously as open source to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I so much appreciate the notion that collecting workshop and public input fits in a formal way to a data protection impact assessment. I mean, when you're assessing, rights and freedoms of the individual, who is it? We kind of magically think we know the harm, we know the benefit, and then we actually talk to people, especially with different diverse backgrounds. You find, here's what the shorter stature people think, and here's what women and immigrants and more wealthy people, people and ideas you never expect, emerge. That we who are relatively privileged, and regulators who are relatively privileged, and in different countries the assessment can be very different. And we've argued that this is part of an ethics review, right? In that you need to seek sort of the, not just the consent of the individual in areas where you cannot seek the consent of the individual, showing you've got the consent of the community by methods that seek to capture, in some democratic way or some informed way. So I think it's a very appealing direction. So let me thank you.
Yeah, Jules, and also to mention, the Dutch report is the first report who connects the embedding of an ethical committee at the city in terms of the decision making, exploring that proportionality and legal ground. I mean, I overlooked this at first, but when I did some close reading today, I thought, oh, they actually, like the ethical review board, it's being called out. So this is a really interesting development that you just mentioned.
I was surprised when studying the way student data is collected and used, for instance, in some cities. Some major cities in the US have an IRB, a formal ethical review, like academic institutions, a Helsinki committee, for their student data, because researchers or teaching experts are always coming in and saying, hey, we introduced this new curriculum, or we used some new technology, or we decided to teach math in this way. Did it work? Let's compare different classes. So, you're experimenting on humans, or you're studying, data from humans. What rules should exist when some teacher or the principal or some researcher says, hey, we want to know what happened during COVID. Who lost out with remote learning? Which populations are going to maybe need the most support, or which technologies were successful? Which methods, right? So we're studying this. Where's it's certainly broadening the issue. Okay. Thank you so much for joining. This is really exciting. We are inspired maybe to figure out how to work with you and do a walk in some other cities. I feel like we'll first need to go with some experts to identify what some of these strange items on the polls are, because it's clearly not so obvious, and whether anyone even knows, finding out the right expert, given that cities are not a simple place and there's many agencies and many layers of activity. It probably is a big research assignment to even map what's going on. Is it even does anybody even have a full map? Yours might be, the first map that exists sometimes in some areas of these technologies in a comprehensive way, let alone the commercial players who have similar sensors and may not be part of the formal city, but are, beaming and collecting data off of the streets. So super interested. Folks, please do take a look at the materials in the comments, and we'll try to respond to other questions that come up. Jonas, Ina, Rob, thanks for joining, and we look forward to continuing the conversations.
Thank you very much.